Marisol wandered slowly through the narrow streets of San Jose del Guaviare, looking in the windows of small stores. The sun was beating down mercilessly, forcing passers-by to huddle against the walls of the houses in search of shade. The dusty air was filled with the odors of spices, roasted corn, and exhaust from passing motorcycles. The hardware store was stuffy, despite the fan running under the ceiling. Marisol pensively thumbed through the kitchen towels, trying to pick out the sturdier ones. Money in their family was counted carefully. The factory where Ricardo worked often paid late wages, and the store where she worked paid very little. "Senora Valdivia, would you like to see our new baking molds?" The saleswoman, a full-figured woman of age with a kind face, called out to her. "No thanks, just towels today." Marisol smiled faintly, remembering how her old muffin mold had cracked. A new one would have to wait until her next paycheck. After finally picking out 2 blue checkered towels, she paid and walked out onto the hot street. It was still 3 more blocks to the house. Marisol walked slowly, feeling the sweat running down her back. Their neighborhood was one of the oldest in the city. 2-story houses with peeling paint, cobblestone streets, old lampposts. The house she and Ricardo lived in had been inherited from her parents. Her father had died 5 years ago, her mother even earlier. Sometimes at night, Marisol thought she could still hear her mother fiddling in the kitchen. Opening the solid wooden door with her key, Marisol stepped into the cool twilight of the hallway. The house smelled damp. The roof had leaked again during the recent rains, and now there was a new yellow stain on the ceiling. Ricardo had promised to fix it, but he hadn't found the time. There was a note on the kitchen table written in familiar, angular handwriting. "I'll be late for work. Don't wait up for dinner." Marisol sighed heavily. Notes like this had been appearing more and more often lately. She folded the new towels neatly into a drawer, pulled vegetables out of the refrigerator, and began to prepare dinner, more out of habit than hunger. The television in the living room monotonously muttered the news. The announcer was talking about a new shooting on the outskirts of town. Marisol turned up the sound. "The police are investigating another case of armed assault in the Alto Mirador neighborhood. According to preliminary reports, there are no casualties, but locals are reporting significant property damage." Marisol shivered and turned off the television. Their neighborhood was considered calm for now, but everyone knew that calm in their city was not a reliable thing. The front door creaked open around 9 o'clock at night. Ricardo walked in, loosening his tie as he walked. He smelled of metal dust and sweat. "I thought you'd be asleep by now," he said, kissing his wife on the cheek. "Decided to wait up. Are you going to have dinner?" "No, had a snack at work. I'll shower and go to bed." Marisol watched her husband climb the stairs to the second floor. His shoulders were tense, his gait tired. 15 years in the factory hadn't gone to waste. At 37, his back was already starting to ache and his hair was showing early gray. She mechanically washed the dishes, wiped the table, adjusted the curtains on the windows. The usual movements, the usual sounds, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of water in the pipes, the humming of the refrigerator. Everything was as usual, but for some reason a vague uneasiness was growing inside. Going up to the bedroom, Marisol found her husband already asleep. His work clothes were tossed carelessly on a chair. His shoes were by the bed. She carefully hung his shirt and pants in the closet, put his boots in the hallway. The night was stuffy. Marisol tossed and turned for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city outside the window. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked, cars occasionally drove by, and a baby cried in a neighboring house. She thought about tomorrow's workday, about having to buy new cleaning products, about the hole in the roof, about the strange fatigue that had accumulated over the past months. Ricardo turned on his other side in his sleep, mumbled something unintelligible. Marisol looked at his face in the dim light of the street lamp shining through the curtains. They had once been madly in love with each other. She remembered their first meeting in the town square, remembered how he had serenaded her under the window of her parents' house, how they had danced at their wedding. Everything was different now, familiar, mundane, dull. The sound of a firecracker going off outside the window was a commonplace in their town, but Marisol flinched anyway. Lately she'd been too nervous, too anxious. Maybe it was the heat and the endless news of crime. Or maybe it was something else, the strange silence that hung between her and her husband, his constant delays at work, the way he looked her in the eye less and less often. Marisol closed her eyes, trying to sleep. Tomorrow she would have to get up early again, go to the store, smile at the customers, count the change, put the goods on the shelves. The ordinary life of an ordinary woman in a small Colombian town. But somewhere deep inside her was ripening a premonition. Something must happen, something inevitably looming like a storm cloud on the horizon. The morning at the El Campesino store began as usual, with dusting the shelves and counting yesterday's receipts. Marisol methodically moved between the shelves, adjusting price tags and arranging the merchandise in straight rows. Senor Benjamin, the shopkeeper, was pedantic about order. The bell over the front door jingled. Marisol looked up. It was Pilar, her partner and best friend. She looked worried. Her usually neatly styled hair was disheveled, and she was nervously crumpling the morning paper in her hands. "Have you heard yet?" Pilar blurted out instead of greeting, approaching the counter. "They showed up in our neighborhood again last night." Marisol looked questioningly at her friend as she continued laying out jars of canned fruit. "The Cordoba gang," Pilar explained in a lowered voice. "They robbed the Mendoza family home yesterday. Can you imagine, in broad daylight? Just walked in and took everything of value, and the police didn't arrive until 2 hours after they were called." Marisol put the last jar on the shelf and wiped her hands on her apron. The Mendoza family lived only 5 blocks from her and Ricardo's house. They were decent people. Don Fernando kept a small bakery. His wife taught elementary school. "They didn't touched anyone?" Marisol asked cautiously. "No, there were no casualties. But Dona Consuelo is in shock. They say she had to call a doctor, and their youngest daughter is now afraid to stay home alone." The first customer entered the store, an elderly woman who bought fresh bread every morning. Marisol hurried toward the counter, but Pilar grabbed her by the elbow. "That's not all," she whispered. "They say the police didn't even investigate. They just drew up a report and left. Everyone knows the Cordoba gang is paying them to keep quiet." Marisol began to attend to the old woman, mechanically answering her usual inquiries about her health and the weather. Disturbing thoughts swirled in her head. Their neighborhood had always been considered relatively safe, but things had changed in recent months. First there had been petty thefts, then the robberies had started, and now the bandits were no longer afraid to operate during the day. The day stretched slowly. The shoppers replaced each other, housewives picking out groceries for lunch, school children dropping in for sweets, workers buying cigarettes and soft drinks. Marisol habitually weighed, counted, gave change, but her thoughts were far away. At lunchtime, she and Pilar settled down in the back room. Pilar pulled out a bag of foil-wrapped sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. Marisol chewed absent-mindedly, looking out the small window overlooking the courtyard. "You know," Pilar said, wiping her lips with a paper napkin, "my cousin says she saw the leader of that gang, Esteban Cordoba. He frequents the El Tigre bar in the plaza." "And what does he look like?" Marisol asked more out of politeness. "He says he doesn't look like a bandit at all. Well-dressed, polite. Only his eyes are scary, cold, like a snake's. And people shut up at his appearance, avert their eyes." Footsteps were heard behind the wall. It was Senor Benjamin making his daily rounds of the store. The women hurriedly gathered the remains of their lunch and returned to the sales room. In the afternoon, a messenger boy came into the store with a telegram for Senor Benjamin. The old man read it, frowned, and went off somewhere, muttering something unintelligible to himself. Half an hour later, he returned with a concerned look. "Senora Valdivia," he called to Marisol, "would you mind staying for an hour today? We have new merchandise to receive, and I must leave on business at once." Marisol nodded, mentally figuring out how to warn Ricardo of the delay. Usually he was already at work at this time and didn't answer the phone. The factory was strict about phone use during working hours. Around 3 in the afternoon, when there were almost no customers, Marisol's cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She answered, expecting to hear another sales representative, but there was a strange rustling sound and then the call was cut off. This call alarmed her even more for some reason. That evening, as they were closing up store, the sky clouded over. Pilar offered to give Marisol a ride. Her husband had recently bought a used scooter. They drove slowly through the narrow streets, maneuvering between parked cars. Pilar chattered on and on about city news, about food prices, about her oldest daughter going to university in Bogotá. "Maybe it's for the best," she said, slowing down at a stoplight. "It's getting too dangerous here. Yesterday, my neighbor saw some suspicious types taking pictures of houses on our street, probably keeping an eye out for anything bad lying around." Marisol remained silent. She thought about her house, about the old wooden frames that could easily be opened from the outside, about the unlocked gate in the backyard. Such thoughts had never crossed her mind before. After saying goodbye to her friend, Marisol walked up to the porch. The house was dark and quiet, which meant Ricardo hadn't returned yet. She turned on the light, put on the kettle, and took the remains of last night's dinner out of the refrigerator. On the table was the morning edition of the newspaper, the same one Pilar had shown her. On the third page, in large letters, it read, "Crime wave sweeps the city. The police are powerless." Ricardo's cell phone didn't answer. Marisol tried calling the factory, but they said the shift was long over. She began cleaning the kitchen, trying to distract herself from her troubled thoughts. She wiped down the countertops, scrubbed the stove, put away clean dishes. At 9 o'clock, the front door finally creaked open. Ricardo looked tired, but somehow excited. He didn't smell like the usual factory dust, but something else, maybe perfume. "I'm sorry I didn't warn you," he said, kissing his wife on the cheek. "There was an emergency after work. I called the factory." "Oh yeah, I went to see the suppliers. The bosses asked me to check the quality of a new batch of metal." Something in his voice struck Marisol as fake, insincere. Or was it that she had become too suspicious after today's talk of crime and deceit? Ricardo went to shower, and Marisol stayed in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the water and the evening sounds of the city outside the window. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed. Sunday morning was unusually hot. Marisol woke early, the sun shining through the faded curtains. Ricardo was gone, though he usually liked to sleep in on Sundays. On his pillow was a note. "Went fishing with the guys from the factory. I'll be back tonight." Marisol folded the note and tucked it into the drawer of her bedside table, where a stack of similar notes from the past month had already accumulated. Each was written in the same hurried handwriting, each explaining his absence with some urgent matter. It was stuffy in the kitchen. Marisol opened the window, letting in the morning noise of the street, the shouts of fruit vendors, the roar of motorcycles, the ringing of bells from the local church. She mechanically prepared breakfast, whipping eggs for scrambled eggs, slicing tomatoes, putting on coffee. Cooking for one person was unusual. The portions were too large. After breakfast, she decided to walk to the market. Sunday was the only day when she could not rush to work. She put on a light dress and small flowers, shabby but comfortable sandals. She paused at the door, looking at herself in the cracked hallway mirror. Her hair had faded, her eyes were shadowed, and her dress should have been replaced with a new one. The market lived its usual noisy life. Merchants were loudly hawking their wares, shoppers were haggling, and children were scurrying between the rows, scaring away stray dogs. Marisol walked slowly along the stalls, looking at the mountains of ripe fruit, bundles of dried herbs, and pyramids of vegetables. Suddenly, she noticed a familiar figure. Ricardo was standing at the jewelry counter, talking animatedly with a tall woman in a bright red dress. Marisol froze behind a large basket of pineapples. The woman was beautiful in a striking, provocative way that Marisol had never seen before. Her thick black hair fell in large waves over her shoulders. Her makeup emphasized her correct facial features, and her dress fit her slender figure. Ricardo said something, leaning in close to the stranger's ear, and she laughed, throwing back her head. Then she took him under her arm, and they walked slowly along the rows. Marisol followed on stiff legs, trying to keep her distance. They stopped at a flower stall, and Ricardo bought the stranger a large bouquet of white lilies. Marisol felt the ground go from under her feet. Just a month ago, on their wedding anniversary, he had said flowers were a waste of money. Now he was buying another woman a bouquet, not even trying to save money. The couple turned a corner, and Marisol lost sight of them. She stood in the middle of the market, sweat running down her back and blood pounding in her temples. People scurried past, someone shoved her shoulder, someone apologized, but she didn't notice anything around her. She didn't get home until 2 hours later. All that time she wandered the streets trying to gather her thoughts. The house was quiet and empty. Marisol mechanically began to do the cleaning, wiped the dust, washed the floors, hung the laundry. The work helped her not to think. Ricardo showed up toward evening. He smelled of river water, and indeed, there were water stains on his shirt, and in his hands he held a bag of fish. "Look what a catch!" he exclaimed happily, showing 3 small fish. "It was a bad bite, but at least we caught something." Marisol looked at her husband, trying to find any sign of guilt or embarrassment in his face. But Ricardo looked his usual self, a little tired, sunburned, with disheveled hair. "Who is she?" Marisol asked quietly. "Who?" Ricardo looked at his wife incomprehensibly. "The woman in the red dress, in the marketplace. I saw you." Ricardo's face froze for a moment. Then he waved his hand carelessly. "Ah, is that Adelaide? An old acquaintance. I met her by chance while I was buying fishing bait. She works at a beauty parlor near the factory. Is that why you were buying her lilies?" "Jesus, Marisol." There was irritation in his voice. "It was her birthday. It's just a courtesy. Are you following me? I just happened to see... You know what?" Ricardo tossed the bag of fish onto the table. "I'm tired. Let's not make a scene over nothing. I'm going to take a shower." He went upstairs, and Marisol stayed in the kitchen. She picked up the bag of fish. The scales were dry, as if the fish hadn't been caught today. She tossed the fish in the trash and began to prepare dinner, chopping vegetables with vigor. The next morning, arriving early for work, Marisol told Pilar all about it. Her friend listened attentively, frowning and shaking her head. "Adelaide Santos," she said thoughtfully. "I know that woman. Her beauty parlor opened 6 months ago. They say she moved from Bogota. It's a strange story to open such an expensive salon in our neighborhood." "Do you think there's something between them?" Marisol tried to keep her voice calm. "I don't know, sweetheart, but you need to watch your husband more closely. Men, they're like children. The minute you turn your back, they find trouble right away." The day dragged on interminably. Marisol worked on automatic, weighing goods, punching checks, giving change. In her head were scraps of yesterday's scene: a red dress, white lilies, Ricardo's hand on the waist of a stranger. When she got home in the evening, the first thing she did was go up to the bedroom. She opened the closet where her husband's clothes hung. Here it was, the white shirt he had worn yesterday. Marisol held it up to her face. A different scent wafted through the smell of laundry detergent. Sweet, floral, a woman's perfume. In her pants pocket she found a crumpled receipt from the laundromat dated last week. But Ricardo had never used a laundry service. Marisol always did his laundry herself. On the back of the receipt was a phone number, the same one that had called her at the store. She was sitting on the bed, clutching the receipt in her hands, when she heard the sound of a car pull up to the house. She quickly put her shirt away in her closet, slipped the receipt into her apron pocket. She went down to the kitchen and started heating up dinner as if nothing had happened. "You look tired," Ricardo said, entering the kitchen. "Busy day?" "Yeah, a lot of work," she replied without turning around. "Dinner's almost ready." They ate in silence. Marisol could feel her husband's eyes on her, but she didn't lift her eyes from her plate. 100 questions swirled in her head, but she remained silent. Not yet. The week dragged agonizingly slow. Marisol watched the changes in her husband's behavior, noting every little detail. Ricardo began to stay late at work more often. Now he always brought a change of clothes with him, explaining that the factory was very dusty. In the mornings, he stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, carefully choosing a shirt and tie. He also started wearing a new cologne, a pungent, spicy scent he'd never used before. Thursday night, Marisol was preparing dinner when the house phone rang. She picked up the receiver, but all she heard in response was silence, then a short beep. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, she heard a woman's voice, which immediately cut off. Marisol recognized the voice, the same laughter she had heard at the market. Ricardo came home late. He smelled of alcohol and cigarette smoke. "Sorry, darling," he said, kicking off his shoes in the hallway. "Jorge from the factory had a birthday party. I tried to call to warn him, but no one picked up." Marisol silently set a plate of warm dinner in front of him. She knew it was a lie. She'd been home all evening and the phone hadn't rung except for those 2 odd calls. The next morning, while cleaning the bedroom, she found a restaurant receipt falling out of his jacket pocket. Dinner for 2, a bottle of expensive wine. The date was last night. Marisol hid the check in the same box where she kept the laundry receipt. On Saturday, Ricardo announced that he was going to the factory. Urgent work, a big order. The bosses asked for help. Marisol watched him get ready. He put on a new shirt she hadn't seen before, spritzed on cologne, combed his hair carefully. "Don't expect me for dinner," he tossed already at the door. "It might be late." Marisol went to the window. Ricardo had gotten into a taxi. He used to always walk to the factory. He said he had to save money. She watched the car disappear around the corner and felt a cold determination growing inside. Taking her bag, she left the house. It was sweltering outside. A thunderstorm was coming. Marisol walked to the factory. It took about half an hour. The gate was locked. There was no one in the guard's booth. Not a single window was lit on the grounds. It looked like no one was really working here on Saturday. Back home, she went up to the bathroom, turned on the water in the shower to muffle the sound, and pulled out her cell phone. She remembered the number from the laundry receipt by heart. It took a long time to ring. Then a woman's voice answered, "Hello? Ricardo?" Marisol silently pressed disconnect. Her hands were shaking, but now she knew for sure it was the voice of the woman from the market. Adelaide's. Downstairs, the front door slammed. Marisol quickly turned off the water and went down to the kitchen. Ricardo was standing by the refrigerator, pouring himself some water. "Did something happen at the factory?" she asked as nonchalantly as possible. "Eh? No, just decided to take a break. I just popped home for a bit. I'll be on my way back soon." He left quickly, not even kissing her goodbye like he usually did. Marisol sat down at the kitchen table looking at her hands on the old checkered tablecloth. Her hands trembled. That evening she heard Ricardo talking on the phone in the bathroom. He'd turned on the water, but the words still reached her. "No, honey, you can't make it tonight. Yes, she's home. Of course, I miss her too. Tomorrow. I promise." Marisol sat on the bed, clutching a pillow in her hands. Her mind was spinning with scraps of phrases, details, little things, all the signs she'd been reluctant to notice for so long. The new clothes, late returns, the strange phone calls, lies, endless lies. The next morning she ventured to talk. Ricardo was going to work, even though it was Saturday again. "We need to talk," Marisol said, stopping him in the hallway. "Right now? I'm running late." "Yes, right now. I know about Adelaide." Ricardo froze with his shoe in his hand, then slowly set it on the floor. "What are you talking about?" "I know everything." Marisol's voice sounded surprisingly calm. "About the restaurants, about the phone calls, about the meetings. Stop lying." "You've been following me?" His face contorted with anger. "Checking my things? My phone? What does it matter? What matters is that I know the truth." Ricardo ran his hand over his face. Then suddenly he laughed, an unpleasant, evil laugh. "The truth? You know nothing." He turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the panes shook. Marisol slowly sank to the floor. Her mind was empty. Only somewhere far away on the edge of her consciousness was the thought. This was it. It had happened. What she had been so afraid of all these days, weeks, months. After the morning scandal, Marisol didn't go to work. For the first time in 5 years, she called Senor Benjamin and said she was sick. The old man kindly asked if she needed medicine, but she refused. No medicine could help the pain that was eating away at her from the inside. She spent the whole day mechanically cleaning the house, scrubbing floors, wiping windows, going through things in closets. In one of the dresser drawers she found a wedding photo of her and Ricardo, young, happy, holding flowers. She stared at the photo, trying to figure out when things had gone wrong, at what point his look changed, when his smile became fake, why she hadn't noticed it before. Toward evening, Pilar called. "What's wrong? Senor Benjamin said you were sick." "I can't take it anymore," Marisol said quietly. "He has confessed. He's having an affair with her." There was silence in the receiver. Then Pilar whined softly. "That rascal! Do you want me to come over?" "No. I need to be alone." "Are you sure? Don't do anything stupid, do you hear?" Marisol hung up the phone. She stood at the window, looking out onto the street where the neighborhood children were playing. Their laughter and shouts seemed unreal, as if they were coming from another world. Ricardo didn't come home that evening or the next day. On Monday, she forced herself to go to work, laying out merchandise, serving customers, checking invoices. It was business as usual, only there was an emptiness inside. Pilar tried to talk to her, but Marisol was silent. What was there to talk about? Everything had already been said. On her way home in the evening, she spotted Ricardo coming out of a jewelry store on the main street. Marisol hid behind a newsstand. Her husband was dressed in a new suit she had never seen before. In his hands, he held a small gift box with a gold bow. Almost without realizing what she was doing, she followed him. Ricardo walked quickly, confidently, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He turned onto Rosario Street, then turned again. Marisol kept her distance, hiding behind trees and parked cars. Her heart was pounding so hard it seemed to be heard all along the street. Ricardo stopped in front of a 2-story house with white columns and a manicured garden. He took a key out of his pocket, he had a key, and stepped inside. Marisol froze on the opposite side of the street. A light was burning in the 2nd-story windows, shadows flickering on the white curtains. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Marisol stood there, unable to move. Then, as if in a dream, she crossed the street, climbed the porch steps. The door was unlocked. The house smelled of expensive perfume and freshly brewed coffee. From somewhere upstairs came voices and laughter. Marisol climbed the stairs, clinging to the banister. The second-floor hallway was carpeted with a thick rug that muffled her footsteps. The bedroom door was ajar. Marisol peeked inside and froze. A large bed with an off-white bedspread. On it were Ricardo and Adelaide. Half undressed, they were kissing, oblivious to everything around them. On the bedside table was an open box from a jewelry store, a gold necklace glittering in it. "So that's how it is." Marisol's voice sounded unexpectedly loud in the semi-dark room. They jumped away from each other. Adelaide shrieked, covering herself with a sheet. Ricardo jumped up from the bed. "What are you doing here? Were you following me? What did you think?" Marisol felt a wave of rage rising inside. "Did you think I was going to sit at home and pretend nothing was going on?" "Get out of here," Ricardo shouted. "This isn't your house." "Oh yes, I can see that. It is her home." Marisol shifted her gaze to Adelaide. Adelaide finally found her voice. "You have no right to break into my house. I will call the police." "Call them," Marisol grinned. "You'll tell them how you sleep with someone else's husband, how you steal other people's happiness." "Enough!" Ricardo grabbed her by the shoulders. "Leave now!" "Get your hands off me," Marisol hissed. "You disgust me. Both of you disgust me." She turned and strode toward the exit. Adelaide's shouts and Ricardo's scolding could be heard behind her, but she didn't turn around. Descending the stairs, she stepped outside. The evening air was hot and humid. A storm was coming. Marisol walked through the streets, unable to make out the road. Blood was pounding in her ears, a picture before her eyes, a white bed, intertwined bodies, a gold necklace on the nightstand. She didn't remember how she'd gotten home. Mechanically, she opened the door, went upstairs to her room. She sat down on the bed, the same bed where she and Ricardo had slept for the past 10 years. It seemed foreign now, desecrated. Around midnight, the door slammed downstairs, heavy footsteps on the stairs. Ricardo entered the bedroom, disheveled with red stains on his neck, smelling of Adelaide's perfume. "I'm taking my things," he said without looking at his wife. "Take it." Marisol looked out the window where the first lightning flashed. "Take everything." He began rummaging through the closet, throwing clothes into a gym bag. Pulled a suitcase out from under the bed, scooping shoes, documents, some papers into it. "Leave the keys," Marisol said when he was already at the door. Ricardo silently tossed the bundle on the dresser and walked out. A moment later, the door slammed again downstairs. Outside, the engine of a cab roared to life. The first raindrops clattered against the eaves. The storm had finally broken, lightning striking one after another, thunder rumbling over the roof. Marisol sat motionless, watching the streams of water running down the glass. In the morning, she found the strength to get up and go to the bathroom. A strange woman looked back at her from the mirror, pale with dark circles under her eyes, her hair disheveled. "Old dress, uncombed hair," Ricardo's voice echoed in her head. Marisol slammed her fist into the mirror with force. A spider web-like crack appeared on the smooth surface. The bedroom still smelled of his cologne. She threw open the windows, ripped off the bedclothes, crumpled them up, and threw them in the corner. Then she went down to the kitchen, pulled out the bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion. Well, it was a special occasion. The wine was tart and bitter. Marisol sat at the kitchen table looking at the empty chair across from where Ricardo usually sat. Now he would be having breakfast at a different table, with a different woman. He would kiss her, give her jewelry, laugh at her jokes. Pilar called. Apparently the neighbors had already spread the news of Ricardo's overnight departure. "I'll be right over," her friend said. No need, Marisol replied. I want to be alone. The day passed like a blur. Marisol tried reading, watching TV, cleaning. Nothing helped to distract herself. Every corner of the house reminded her of Ricardo. Everything held traces of him. There was a scratch on the table. He'd made it when he was fixing the lamp. The stain on the wallpaper was the mark of his favorite chair. Here's the toolbox in the pantry. He'd collected it over the years, buying one thing and another. She forced herself to eat in the evening, just because she had to. The food seemed tasteless, but Marisol mechanically chewed, swallowed, drank water. The same thought kept running through her mind. What now? How to live on? Where to go? A week passed. Marisol lived as if on autopilot. She got up on her alarm clock, went to work, came home. She deliberately took extra shifts at the store to avoid staying in an empty house. Senor Benjamin looked at her with sympathy but said nothing. Apparently, rumors of Ricardo's departure had already spread throughout the neighborhood. The house seemed huge and empty. The floorboards creaked at night. The wind blew through the cracks between the frames. Water dripped somewhere, all the same sounds as before, but now they seemed ominous, alien. Marisol slept on the couch in the living room. She hadn't gone up to the bedroom since that day. Ricardo's things remained in the closets, the ones he hadn't taken. His razor in the bathroom, his old shoes in the hallway, his work gloves on a shelf in the pantry. Marisol didn't touch them, as if these objects could burn. They were mute witnesses to her loneliness, reminders of betrayal. On Saturday, she awoke to a phone call. The clock read 7 in the morning. Our house is already sold. Ricardo's voice sounded cold and businesslike. Pack up and leave. You have 3 days. Marisol clutched the receiver so hard her knuckles turned white. What are you talking about? This is my house, my parents' house. Not anymore. I sold it. It's all official. You couldn't. You have no right to. A short beep sounded in the receiver. Marisol sat there, unable to move. Then she jumped up, rushed to the secretary where the documents were kept. With trembling hands, she began going through the papers, the marriage certificate, old utility receipts, her parents' will. The documents for the house were in a separate folder. How on earth had he done it? It began to rain outside. Drops drummed on the eaves, dripped down the windows. Marisol stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the wet streaks on the windows. Her home, her sanctuary, the only thing left of her parents. And now she had to leave? The doorbell rang. Pilar stood on the threshold, anxious, with a wet umbrella in her hands. The neighbor called, said she heard you screaming. What happened? Marisol silently let her friend into the house. They walked to the kitchen where the phone receiver still lay on the table. He sold the house. Marisol's voice sounded muffled, lifeless. Stole the deeds and sold it. What? Pilar slumped in her chair. How is that possible, without your consent? I don't know. Probably forged my signature or found some loophole in the law. We should go to the police. Marisol grinned bitterly. The police? The same one that can't handle the local gangsters? The one that takes bribes and turns a blind eye to crime? Pilar poured water from a decanter and handed the glass to her friend. Have a drink, and let's think calmly. There must be some way out. Marisol took a sip. The water seemed tasteless, like everything the last few days. You know what the worst part is? She said, staring into the emptiness in front of her. I'm not even surprised. After everything he's done, it's just another betrayal. They sat in the kitchen for hours. Pilar suggested various options: go to a lawyer, write a statement to the prosecutor's office, talk to a notary she knew. Marisol shook her head silently. She knew. Everything is useless. She had no money for a good lawyer, no connections in the authorities, no proof of her righteousness. After her friend left, Marisol began to walk around the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the curtains. Each thing held a memory. Here her father had taught her to read. Here her mother had baked her famous pies. On this couch she had lain sick when Ricardo had nursed her. Ricardo, the man she trusted most in the world, had become her greatest enemy. In the evening the phone rang again. This time it was a woman, judging by the voice, not young, official. Senora Valdivia, I'm calling about the sale and purchase of house number 23 on Olivo Street. I wanted to clarify when you plan to vacate the premises. Marisol silently hung up the phone, then unplugged the phone. No more calls, no more conversations, no more explanations. She spent the night without sleep. She lay on the couch, listening to the sound of the rain and the occasional car horn honking from the street. Her mind was filled with scraps of thoughts, plans, ideas, but they all fell apart before they could take shape. How could you fight someone who knew all your weaknesses? Who's lived next to you for 10 years, studied your every habit, every character trait? In the morning, she forced herself to get up and go to work. The store was unusually crowded, a Sunday crowd of shoppers rushing to stock up on groceries for the week. Marisol worked mechanically, weighing, counting, packing. Pilar tried to talk to her, but she was silent. Toward evening, a neighbor, an elderly woman who lived across the street from Marisol, came into the store. "Honey, is it true you're selling the house?" she asked, looking at the tomatoes. "I saw some people looking at it from outside." "I'm not selling the house," Marisol replied, feeling a wave of anger rising inside. "It was stolen from me, like they steal everything in this town." The neighbor recoiled fearfully and hurried toward the exit. Senor Benjamin, who heard this conversation, shook his head. "Go home, Marisol. You are in no condition to work today." Waiting for her at home was an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a copy of the sales contract with stamps and signatures. Her signature, perfectly forged, indistinguishable from the real thing. At the bottom of the page was an amount that made Marisol's eyes darken. Ricardo had sold the house for next to nothing just to get rid of it. She sat on the hallway floor, clutching the contract in her hands. It was getting dark outside the window, but she didn't turn on the light. In the twilight, the house seemed unfamiliar, alien, as if it already knew it would soon have new owners. The police station was an old 2-story building with peeling paint on the walls. Marisol climbed the cracked steps and pushed open the heavy door. Inside smelled of stale tobacco smoke and cheap coffee. A young policeman sat behind the shabby desk, typing away at an old computer. He didn't even look up when Marisol approached. "I want to file a report," she said, trying to keep her voice firm. "For what reason?" The policeman continued to stare into the monitor. "My husband, ex-husband, he sold our house without my consent, forged the documents." The policeman finally pulled away from the computer. "Do you have the documents with you?" Marisol pulled a folder out of her bag, a copy of the purchase agreement, old house papers, her parents' will. The policeman lazily flipped through the papers. "And what's illegal here? Here is your signature on the contract." "That's not my signature. He forged it." "Can you prove it?" Marisol fell silent. How do you prove forgery when the handwriting is copied perfectly? How to explain that the man she'd lived with for 10 years was capable of such betrayal? "I need to talk to someone in charge," she said after a pause. The policeman shrugged. "Second floor, office 12. But I don't think it will make any difference." The second floor was stuffy and dusty. Marisol walked down the hallway, reading the numbers on the doors. There were voices coming from the offices, the sound of fans running, the clatter of typewriters. Office 12 greeted her with the smell of stale sweat and stale coffee. At the desk sat a heavy man in a captain's uniform. His tunic was unbuttoned and a half-empty bottle of mineral water stood on the table. "Have a seat, Senora," he said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. The heat is unbearable today, isn't it? Marisol sat down on a rickety chair. Pulling out her papers again, she began to explain the situation. The captain listened, occasionally sipping water from his bottle. "You see, Senora Valdivia," he said when she had finished, "the situation is complicated. Technically, all the documents are in order. Your signature is notarized. The transaction is registered. But it's fraud." "Maybe. But to prove it, you need signature expertise, witness testimony, a lot of paperwork. And we don't even have enough people to investigate serious crimes, you know." "Serious crimes?" Marisol pitched forward. "And stealing a house isn't a serious crime." The captain waved his hands. "There are gangs in the city, murders, robberies. And you're suggesting we deal with family squabbles." "Family squabbles?" Marisol's voice shook with indignation. "A man stole a house that has belonged to my family for generations." "Take some good advice." The captain leaned over the table. "Get a good lawyer. File a civil suit. This is not a police matter." "I don't have money for a lawyer." "Then I don't know how I can help." He leaned back in his chair. "Next." Marisol walked out of the office on shaky legs. The hallway was dark. The daylight bulbs flickered and crackled. She leaned against the wall, trying to gather her thoughts. More people appeared on the first floor. Some drunk man was yelling at the cops, demanding his confiscated license back. A tearful woman was writing a missing purse report. Two teenagers sat on a bench with their heads down. Apparently they had been arrested for some minor offense. Marisol stepped outside. The sun was beating down mercilessly, but she didn't feel hot. Inside was emptiness and coldness, the same feeling of helplessness that had haunted her for the past few days. In the alley behind the police station, she spotted a familiar car, the same blue Ford she'd seen Ricardo driving lately. Adelaide was sitting behind the wheel, and next to her was one of the policemen Marisol had seen at the station. They talked animatedly about something. Then the policeman pulled out some papers and handed them to Adelaide. Everything fell into place. That was why the police wouldn't help. Adelaide had her own people, her own connections. Perhaps she'd arranged in advance for Marisol's statement not to be taken seriously. She walked home, though it was a long way. Cars passed by. Passers-by hurried about their business. Stores and cafes were open. The usual city life, in which now there was no place for justice. At home, she called Pilar first thing. "You were right. The police have bought everything." "I told you so," her friend's voice sounded bitter. "In this town, the law is on the side of those with money and connections." "What am I supposed to do, Pilar? Where do I go?" "Stay at my place for now. We'll find you a lawyer who'll take the case with no upfront." "No," Marisol interrupted her. "I'm not leaving my house. I won't let them win so easily." She hung up the phone and sat down at the kitchen table. It was beginning to get dark outside the window. The windows were lit up in the house across the street. An ordinary family lived there. The husband worked as a school teacher. The wife ran a small bakery. They often said hello to Marisol, treating her to fresh baked goods. I wonder what they'll think when they hear about the sale of the house. Would they believe the official version or guess at the truth? Marisol pulled a bottle of wine out of the cabinet, the last of the wine she and Ricardo had bought for Christmas. She poured a glass but didn't drink it. She just sat there, staring at the dark red liquid that reflected the dim light of the kitchen lamp. The doorbell rang. A courier stood on the threshold with a bouquet of white lilies. "Senora Valdivia, these are for you." There was a note attached to the bouquet. Marisol recognized Adelaide's handwriting. "Thank you for visiting the police. It was very entertaining. Don't waste your time. The house is mine." 3 days passed like a nightmare. Marisol methodically packed her belongings, putting them into old cardboard boxes. Every item she picked up evoked memories. A porcelain figurine that had been her mother's 16th birthday present, a shabby embroidered tablecloth that her grandmother had brought back from Spain, kitchen towels that had been bought recently, seemingly in another life. Pilar came every evening helping to pack, trying to comfort. But what could words of comfort mean when your world was crumbling before your eyes? "You can stay with me as long as it takes," her friend said as she taped up another box. "The kids will be glad. Remember how Maria loves your stories?" Marisol nodded, continuing to mechanically fold clothes. She couldn't imagine living in someone else's house, sleeping on someone else's bed, eating at someone else's table, even if that house belonged to her best friend. Tuesday night, the truck arrived. Two surly movers quickly hauled out the boxes and the few pieces of furniture Marisol had decided to take with her. The rest remained in the house, now someone else's house. She walked around the rooms one last time, running her hand along the walls. Right here, in the living room, was the Christmas tree. In this corner of the bedroom stood her mother's dressing table. In the kitchen, you could still see the pot marks on the old stove. Every scratch, every stain, every crack in the wall, everything had a story. On the threshold she stopped, pulled an old key out of her pocket, the same one her father had solemnly handed her after his last return from the hospital. "This is your home now, girl," he had said then. Marisol put the key on the windowsill. She didn't need it anymore. Pilar's house was 10 blocks from her former home, small but cozy, with a tiny garden where lush bougainvillea bushes grew. Pilar's children, 13-year-old Maria and 10-year-old Pablo, helped bring in boxes, absent-mindedly offering to put things in their rooms. "You'll sleep in the guest room," Pilar said, opening the door of a small room on the first floor. "It's a little cramped, but it's fine," Marisol interrupted her. "Thank you." That evening, when the children were asleep and Pilar was in the kitchen making tea, a neighbor, a full, middle-aged woman with a kind face, knocked on the door. "I'm sorry for the late visit," she said, shifting from foot to foot. "But I have to tell you, I saw them moving into your house." Marisol froze with the cup in her hands. "Who?" "Your ex-husband and that woman, Adelaide. They brought in a lot of new furniture, and I also heard her bossing the workers around, telling them to tear down the old kitchen, remodel the bathroom." Pilar tried to stop her neighbor, but she continued. "And then a car came with a gardener. Adelaide told him to uproot all the old rose bushes in the garden, the same ones that your mother, God rest her soul, loved so much." Marisol stood silently and walked out of the kitchen. Locking herself in her new room, she sat down on the narrow bed. Muffled voices could be heard behind the thin wall. Pilar was reprimanding her neighbor for her tactlessness. She couldn't sleep at night. The bed was unfamiliar. The pillow smelled like someone else's laundry detergent. The light of a street lamp shone through the window, casting strange shadows across the ceiling. Somewhere in the house the clock ticked, the refrigerator rumbled, the floorboards creaked under someone's cautious footsteps. It was time to go to work in the morning. Marisol dressed, trying not to make any noise. It was still very early. In the kitchen was breakfast, carefully left by Pilar. Fresh rolls, orange juice, coffee in a thermos. It was farther to walk to the store now. Marisol walked through unfamiliar streets, looking at other people's houses, other people's gardens, other people's lives. How easily things could change. Yesterday you had your own home, and today you were homeless, living at the mercy of a friend. In the store, work went on as usual. Senor Benjamin was unusually kind, even offered a raise. Apparently, rumors of her plight had already spread throughout the neighborhood. Marisol refused. She didn't want pity. In the evening, on her way home from work, she took the long road, the one that passed by her former home. It was already dark, but the windows were brightly lit. Through the curtains she could see the new furniture, the unfamiliar paintings on the walls. The gardener was working in the garden, digging up rose bushes by the light of a portable lamp and tossing them into a pile by the fence. On the porch stood Adelaide in an elegant house dress, telling the gardener what to do. Next to her stood Ricardo, putting his arm around her waist. They looked like the perfect couple, handsome, content with life. Marisol turned away and walked quickly away. Blood pounded in her ears and colored spots swam before her eyes. She almost ran through the dark streets, bumping into passers-by, not noticing the puddles under her feet. At Pilar's house, dinner was waiting for her and the worried looks of the children. They tried to behave as usual, but Marisol could see them whispering, shutting up at her appearance. "Aunt Marisol," Maria said suddenly, "is it true that your house now belongs to that wicked woman?" "Maria!" Pilar shouted at her. "Don't ask such questions." "Nothing," Marisol smiled through the force. "Yes, it's true. Sometimes unfair things happen in life." "But how so?" the girl persisted. "Can't you just take someone else's house?" "It turns out you can," Marisol replied quietly. "If you have money, connections, and no conscience, anything is possible." A week of living in Pilar's house turned into an endless series of sleepless nights and gray days. Marisol continued to go to work, mechanically performing her duties, but more and more often caught the sympathetic glances of the customers. News of how she had lost her home spread throughout the neighborhood. On her way back from the store on Friday night, she passed by her former home again. Now it was being renovated, with workers removing old furniture, stripping wallpaper, replacing windows. Everything that made up the history of the house was being ruthlessly destroyed. There was a dumpster by the gate. Marisol looked inside and froze. Among the construction debris she saw an old wooden box, the same one in which her mother kept family photos. With trembling hands she pulled it out. The lid was broken, the hinges were bent, but the photos were still inside, yellowed by time. She couldn't bear it any longer. Clutching the box in her hands, Marisol walked briskly toward El Tigre, the bar Pilar had mentioned. She knew it was dangerous, knew she might regret her decision, but right now she didn't care. The bar was in an old building with dark windows and a neon sign that barely flickered in the dusk. It was smoky inside, with a few customers sitting at tables, sipping beer. At the counter, two men were playing cards, occasionally bickering loudly. Marisol approached the bartender, a tall, thin man with long gray hair gathered into a ponytail. "I need to speak to Señor Cordoba," she said quietly but firmly. The bartender gave her an appraising look. "Señor Cordoba is busy." "It's important. It's about the house on Olivo Street." The bartender paused, then nodded to someone in a dark corner of the room. A stout man in a leather jacket approached the counter. "Follow me." They went through the kitchen, up the narrow staircase to the second floor. It was quieter here, with only muffled music coming from downstairs. The guard knocked on the massive door, waited for an answer, and gestured for Marisol to enter. The study was furnished with expensive furniture, leather armchairs, a heavy oak desk, gilt-framed paintings on the walls. Behind the desk sat Esteban Cordoba, a man whose name was spoken in whispers throughout the neighborhood. He was not what Marisol had imagined him to be. No ostentatious wealth or brute strength, just a well-dressed middle-aged man with an attentive gaze and graying temples. "Have a seat, Senora." His voice was unexpectedly soft. "To what do I owe the visit?" Marisol sat down in the chair, placing the shabby picture box in her lap. She took a deep breath and began to talk about her husband, about the betrayal, about the sale of the house, about her futile attempts to find justice. Cordoba listened in silence, occasionally tapping his fingers on the table. When she finished, he poured whiskey from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. "Drink up. You need to calm down." Marisol took a sip. The whiskey burned her throat, but it helped her gather her thoughts. "I have a suggestion," she said, pulling a file folder from her bag. "Here are the original deeds to the house, the ones my husband couldn't steal, and my parents' will. Legally, the house still belongs to me. And what do you want me to do? I'll remortgage the house to you, legally, through a notary. All I ask in return is that you get these people out of there. Today." Cordoba scrutinized the documents, then looked up at Marisol. "Do you realize you won't be able to get the house back after this?" "I understand, but I'd rather you have it than them." "What about the law, the police?" Marisol grinned bitterly. "The law? In this town, the law is on the side of those with money and connections. Adelaide has both. I have nothing but these papers." Cordoba stood up, walked to the window. The lights of the city twinkled behind the dark glass. "You know, Senora," he said after a long pause, "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I know every house, every family. Your father was a good man. When my mother was sick, he gave her free shots, brought her medicine." He turned to Marisol. "Okay, I'll help you, but I must warn you, it won't be not very pretty." "I don't care," Marisol said firmly. "Do what you think is right." Cordoba pressed a button on the desk. Two men entered the office, the same guard and another, taller and tougher. "Take the senora to my notary," Cordoba ordered. "Have him draw up the proper paperwork, and then take care of the house on Olivo Street." The notary turned out to be a fussy little man with thick glasses. He quickly prepared all the necessary documents without even asking about the details of the transaction. Apparently, he was used to not asking unnecessary questions. While Marisol was signing the papers, another man came into the office, a tall man with a military appearance. He said something quietly to Cordoba, who nodded. "Everything is ready," the notary said, putting the final seal. "The house now officially belongs to Señor Cordoba." Marisol stood up. Strangely, she felt no regret or fear, only cold determination and anticipation of what was to come. "Go home, Señora," Cordoba said, "to Pilar's house, and don't come out of there until morning no matter what you hear." It was already getting dark outside. Marisol walked at a brisk pace, clutching the box of photographs, the only thing she had left of her former life. Somewhere in the distance she heard the roar of engines, several cars speeding toward Olivo Street. Pilar's house was quiet. The children were already asleep. Pilar herself was watching television in the living room. "Where have you been?" she asked worriedly. "I was getting worried." "Everything's fine," Marisol replied. "Just solving some cases." She walked to her room, sitting down on her bed. Outside the window she heard the noise of cars again shouting, the sound of breaking glass. Then it all went quiet. Marisol opened her jewelry box, pulled out the pictures. Here she was, small, with her parents in the garden, the same garden where the rose bushes were now being uprooted. Here was her high school graduation. Here was her wedding to Ricardo. They were so happy, so in love. A distant siren sounded from the street. Marisol went to the window, pulled back the curtains. Whatever was happening on Olivo Street now, she didn't want to see it. Whatever was going to happen would happen without her. Pilar knocked softly on the door. "Are you awake? Shall we have some tea?" "No, thank you," Marisol replied. "I'm very tired. I just want to be alone." She lay down on the bed without undressing. The room was dark, with only the light of a street lamp coming through the gap between the curtains. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked, counting down the minutes until the story's denouement. Marisol closed her eyes. There was an emptiness inside. No fear, no regret, no joy. Only the firm conviction that she had made the right choice, the only choice she had left. The next day stretched agonizingly slow. Marisol went to work as usual, though every nerve in her body was tingling with tension. Señor Benjamin reprimanded her twice for her absent-mindedness. She gave the wrong change and mixed up the prices of the goods. Neighbors ran into the store, whispering among themselves. To Marisol reached the scraps of conversation. Last night on the street, Olivo saw some suspicious cars, heard shouting. "They say the Cordoba people are up to something," one of the shoppers said as she laid out vegetables on the counter. "You be quiet," her friend cut her off, casting a wary glance at Marisol. After lunch, the same security guard from El Tigre's bar came into the store, a tall man in a leather jacket. He pretended to examine the canned goods, then approached the counter. "Señor Cordoba asks that you be ready. Tonight will decide everything." Marisol nodded without raising her eyes. Her hands, going over the change in the cash register, trembled slightly. "One more thing." The guard placed an envelope on the counter. "Here are copies of all the documents. Keep them." When he left, Pilar walked over to Marisol. "What's going on? Are you up to something?" "Don't ask," Marisol shook her head. "The less you know, the better." The day was nearing its end. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon, coloring the sky blood red. Marisol closed the cash register, counting the proceeds. Everything was business as usual, everything on schedule, as if it was just a very ordinary day. When she left the store, she didn't go straight to Pilar's house. Her feet carried her toward Olivo Street. It was unusually quiet outside her former home. The construction debris had been removed. The new windows gleamed in the setting sun. Adelaide's car, the same blue Ford, was parked in the driveway. Marisol hid around the corner of a neighboring house, watching. Adelaide came out of the front door in an elegant evening gown, followed by Ricardo in a new suit. They talked animatedly about something, laughing. Then they got into the car and drove away, probably to another dinner at an expensive restaurant. The lights came on in the house. The servants must have been finishing cleaning. Marisol recognized the silhouette of a woman pulling the curtains in the living room, the same living room where her parents' old couch had once stood, where family photographs hung on the walls. She stood there for a while longer, absorbing every detail, memorizing every little thing. It was the last night Ricardo and Adelaide would consider this house theirs, the last evening of their quiet life. Back at Pilar's house, Marisol locked herself in her room, pulled out of her bag the envelope the guard handed over. Inside were not only copies of the deeds to the house, but also some other papers, bills, bank statements, contracts. She ran her eyes over the lines and froze. It was proof that Adelaide had gotten her beauty parlor illegally, through front men. Pilar knocked on the door. "Are you going to have dinner?" "No, thank you. I'm not hungry." "Marisol," her friend's voice sounded worried. "Whatever you're up to, be careful. Don't worry, it'll all be over soon." Marisol spread the papers out on the bed, scrutinizing each document. Cordoba had clearly been preparing for this for a long time, gathering information, waiting for the opportune moment. Her appearance in the bar simply gave him a legitimate reason to act. It was getting dark outside the window. A siren sounded somewhere in the distance, then all was quiet. Marisol sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house, the ticking of the clock, Pilar's footsteps in the kitchen, the muffled voices of the children in the next room. At 10 o'clock her cell phone rang. The number was hidden. "Everything is ready," said the familiar voice of the security guard. "We start in an hour." Marisol placed the phone on the nightstand. Her hands no longer trembled. There was a strange emptiness inside. No fear, no doubt, no remorse. Only the cold certainty that today justice would finally be served. She pulled a black dress out of her closet, the same one she'd worn at her father's funeral. She carefully straightened the folds and hung it on the back of a chair. Then she sat down at the little table by the window and began to write a letter. "Dear Pilar, when you read this," she wrote at length, choosing her words carefully. She explained her actions, apologized for any trouble she might have caused, thanked her for her support and friendship. When the letter was finished, she folded it and labeled the envelope. At 11 o'clock, the sound of approaching cars came from the street. Marisol went to the window and pulled back the curtain a little. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows drove slowly down the street. She knew where they were going. The phone rang again. Senora Valdivia. It was Cordoba's own voice. Are you sure of your decision? Yes, Marisol answered firmly. Absolutely sure. Good. You'll get confirmation in the morning that it's done. She disconnected the phone and sat down on the bed. The room was dark and quiet. Somewhere out there in the night, Cordoba's men were on their way to her former home. She imagined them going inside, getting Ricardo and Adelaide out of there, showing them the real deeds to the house. Perhaps Ricardo would yell and threaten the police. Perhaps Adelaide would try to use her connections. But it didn't matter anymore. Cordoba had power that neither corrupt police officers nor corrupt officials could resist. Marisol lay on the bed without undressing. Outside the window, the siren of a police car flew. Apparently, one of the neighbors had already called the station, but she knew the police wouldn't interfere. Not this time. She closed her eyes, imagining Ricardo and Adelaide packing their things, leaving the house in a hurry. How their perfect plan, their beautiful lie, would crumble. Justice must be served, even if it took the help of those everyone thought were criminals. After all, Marisol thought, in this city, everyone chooses their own path to justice. And if the law can't protect honest people, then we'll have to seek protection from those above the law. 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of a house on Olivo Street at exactly midnight. 8 men got out of the cars, stout men in dark clothing. The last to emerge was Esteban Cordoba himself, elegant even at this late hour, in an impeccably tailored suit. The lights were on in the house Ricardo, and Adelaide had just returned from a restaurant. Through the windows you could see them sitting in the living room. Adelaide was still in her evening dress. Ricardo had already taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. Cordoba nodded to his men. 2 remained at the cars. The rest surrounded the house quickly and silently. Cordoba himself went up on the porch and pressed the bell button. Footsteps were heard inside the house. The door was opened by Ricardo. "Who?" he began, and hesitated as he recognized the man standing before him. "Good evening, Senor Valdivia," Cordoba said politely. "May I come in? We have an important conversation." Without waiting for an answer, he stepped into the antechamber. 4 of his men appeared behind him. Ricardo backed away. "What do you want? I'll call the police." "No need to disturb our valiant law enforcement officers," Cordoba grinned. "They're very busy in another part of town today." Adelaide looked out of the living room. Seeing the uninvited guests, she turned pale. "Ricardo, what's going on?" "Everyone into the living room, please." Cordoba gestured in the direction. "We have a real estate matter to discuss." Everything had changed in the living room. The old paintings and photographs were gone, replaced by modern abstract paintings. A leather settee replaced the shabby sofa, and there were new lamps on the walls. Cordoba sat down in an armchair, pulled a file folder from the inside pocket of his jacket. "So, Senor Valdivia, Senora Santos, I have to give you some unpleasant news. You are living in a house that doesn't belong to you." "What nonsense is that?" Ricardo was indignant. "I have all the papers for—" "Forged documents," Cordoba interrupted him. "Very high-quality forgeries, no argument. But the real documents are right here." He placed the papers on the glass coffee table. "And according to them, the house now belongs to me." Adelaide grabbed the papers, quickly ran her eyes over them. "That's impossible. We bought the house legally." "You bought the house with forged documents. And this afternoon, the rightful owner, Senora Marisol Valdivia, officially handed it over to me, with all the necessary signatures and seals." Ricardo collapsed into a chair. His face blanched. "Marisol? She couldn't. Oh, you are mistaken, Cordoba smiled. And I am now the rightful owner of this house. Adelaide jumped up. I'm going to call my lawyer. I have connections with the police. I'm sure you will, Cordoba nodded. But I'm afraid your connections won't help you today. You have half an hour to gather your personal belongings and leave the house. Half an hour? Ricardo was indignant. You can't. I can. Cordoba's voice became hard. And if you're still here in 30 minutes, my men will help you out. Believe me, you won't like it. He nodded to his men. 2 stayed in the living room, the rest dispersed around the house, making sure no one tried to take out anything but personal belongings. The next half hour was like a chaotic spectacle. Adelaide was thrashing around the bedroom, throwing designer dresses and shoes into her suitcase. Ricardo was frantically gathering documents and money, scattering them in his pockets. It's all her, Adelaide shouted, trying to zip up the overstuffed suitcase. Your bloody wife! How dare she get involved with those bandits? Shut up, snapped at Ricardo. Just shut up. In the hallway, one of Cordoba's men looked at his watch. Time's up. Adelaide tried to grab another bag of jewelry, but the guard blocked her way. Only what's already packed. The rest stays in the house. It was dark and quiet outside. The neighbors were undoubtedly watching from behind the curtains, but no one dared to go out or call the police. Everyone knew, when Cordoba showed up, it was best not to get involved. Ricardo and Adelaide stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by suitcases and bags. Their car was left in the garage. Cordoba had said it belonged to him now, too, as part of the house's property. Where to now? Adelaide whispered. Ricardo did not answer. He looked at the house where he had lived for 10 years. At the windows he himself had painted last summer. At the rose bushes they hadn't had time to uproot. Cordoba was the last to leave. Lock the door and put a sign on it that said, "Private property. No trespassing." Ah, yes, he turned to the couple frozen on the sidewalk. I almost forgot. Senora Santos, I have some interesting documents about how you got the license for your beauty salon. I think the IRS would be very interested in that information. Adelaide turned even paler. Ricardo grabbed a cab passing by. They hurriedly loaded their things and drove away. Into the night, into the unknown, into a new life where they would have to start all over again. Cordoba pulled out his cell phone. Senora Valdivia, it's done. They're not coming back. Across town, in the small room of Pilar's house, Marisol sat on the bed, clutching the phone in her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from grief, not from joy, but from relief. It was finally over. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to break. A new day brought with it a new reality. She had lost her home, but she had gotten justice. Gave up the last thing she had to get revenge on those who betrayed her trust. Footsteps were heard downstairs. Pilar was already up, starting to prepare breakfast. Soon the children would wake up. The normal day would begin. But for Marisol, nothing would be ordinary anymore. She had made her choice, crossed a line beyond which there was no turning back. On the table was a letter for Pilar, the same letter she had written the night before. Marisol took it, tore it into small pieces, and threw it in the trash. There was no need for that letter now. The story ended exactly as she had planned. News of the night's events on Olivo Street spread through the neighborhood with the speed of wildfire. By morning, all the neighbors knew that Cordoba's men had kicked Ricardo and Adelaide out of the house, that there was a new sign on the door, that strange men in black clothes were on duty in the yard. Marisol woke early, though she had hardly slept at all during the night. Outside the window, the rain was coming down, a fine, drizzling rain that turned the streets into mirrors of puddles. She went down to the kitchen where Pilar was already preparing breakfast for the children. "Did you hear?" her friend asked, setting plates of hot flatbread on the table. "The whole neighborhood is just talking about it." Marisol nodded silently. pouring herself a cup of coffee. She could feel her friend's attentive gaze on her, but she wasn't ready for an explanation. Not at the moment. The store was unusually busy. Customers were coming in not so much for groceries as to discuss recent events. Marisol stood behind the counter, mechanically releasing the merchandise while passion simmered around her. "They say they were thrown out right in their pajamas," exclaimed an elderly senora, picking out tomatoes. "What pajamas? They were in evening clothes, just back from the restaurant," her neighbor corrected her. "And I heard Adelaide sobbing and begging to be allowed to take all the jewelry." Senor Benjamin tried several times to quiet the talk, but without success. The events were too juicy to be kept quiet about. Around noon, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit entered the store. Marisol didn't immediately recognize him as Ricardo. He seemed to have aged overnight, stubble covering his gaunt face, his eyes red from lack of sleep. The customers were instantly silent. Senor Benjamin took a step toward the counter, but Marisol stopped him with a gesture. "We need to talk," Ricardo said hoarsely. "We have nothing to talk about," Marisol replied as she continued to arrange the fruit on the display case. "Look, what you did. It's crazy. Contacting Cordoba and forging documents and stealing my house isn't crazy." Ricardo looked around. Everyone in the store was looking at them. He lowered his voice. "We can fix this. Adelaide has connections." "Had connections," Marisol interrupted him. "Now she has none. Neither do you. You don't understand. Cordoba is a dangerous man. He's a bandit, a criminal. And what are you?" Marisol finally looked him in the eye. "The one who betrayed his wife, stole her house, threw her out on the street. Who are you after that?" Ricardo gripped the counter, knuckles turning white. "I loved you. I really loved you once." "Get out," Marisol said quietly. "Get out before I call Cordoba." He stood for a few more seconds, opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. He turned and walked out of the store, slouching under the stares of the customers. Pilar walked over to her friend, put a hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" Marisol nodded. Strangely enough, she really was fine. There was no pain or anger left inside, just a quiet confidence that she had made the right choice. The day stretched on slowly. After lunch, a woman from Adelaide's beauty salon, one of the manicurists, came into the store. "Senora Santos asked me to tell you," she said, nervously rubbing the strap of her purse. "She's leaving town, for good, and the salon is being sold." Marisol turned away silently to the shelves of canned goods. The woman stomped around some more and left. That evening, as she closed the store, she heard the roar of motorcycles. Cordoba's men rode down the street. Now they often patrolled the neighborhood, showing everyone who the new owner was. Returning to Pilar's house, Marisol walked past her former home. It stood dark and silent with only a dim light burning in the first-floor window. A guard was on duty there. The rose bushes that Adelaide had wanted to uproot were still growing in the garden. Maybe Cordoba had decided to keep them. At home was Pilar's place now. Dinner and the noisy chatter of the children awaited her. Maria talked about school news. Pablo bragged about his A in math. A normal family evening, as if nothing had happened. Later, when the children were asleep and Pilar was watching the evening news, Marisol sat in her small room, sorting through a box of pictures. Here she was with her parents on the front porch. Here's the first Christmas after they were married. Here is the day they planted those very rose bushes. The phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Senora Valdivia." Cordoba's voice sounded unusually soft. "I thought you should know. They've really left town. They won't be coming back again." "Thank you," Marisol replied quietly. Marisol hung up the phone and walked over to the window. The rain was still falling, blurring the outlines of the houses and trees. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, stood her house, now a stranger but still holding the memory of the past. She didn't know what would happen next, where she would live, how her life would turn out, whether she would ever meet a new love. But she knew one thing for sure. Justice had been served, even if in such a strange, wrong way. The floorboards creaked in the corridor as Pilar went to her room. Tomorrow would be a new day, an ordinary day in a city where everyone chooses his own path to justice, where law and lawlessness intertwine so closely that sometimes it is hard to know where one ends and the other begins. Marisol took one last look out the window and pulled back the curtains. After all, she had gotten what she wanted: revenge, justice, retribution, even if the cost was her own home.